Most of us have probably not spent time with a person who's actively dying, and even not seen a person after death.
Hello and welcome to Self Talk. I'm Rachel Astarte. Today, my guest is Maria Verdicchio. She is an end-of-life designer and nature and forest therapy guide, providing heart-centered and pragmatic advanced care planning, end-of-life education, and life transition ceremonies. Welcome, Maria.
Thanks, Rachel.
I know we have a lot to talk about because this is one of my favorite subjects ever since I was a kid is death. So we're going to dive right in. But before we do, and we're going to talk about a lot of stuff around what you do. But one of the elements that you work with that I find so intriguing is how we can become more death literate. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But before we get to that, I wonder if you could share with the listeners how you came to do what you do.
Yeah. Well, out of fear, basically. I always think I was around 10 years old. I might have been younger when my Italian grandmother died, my Nonna. And at the time, and up till then, my family didn't speak about death. Or dying. And so that was very significant for me. It was, my grandfather had died prior to that, but I didn't know him and he didn't live in Vancouver where I grew up. So when my Nonna died and I had to go to the church, the Catholic church for the funeral, and everybody was so black and it was so, just nobody said anything. We just went through the motions for the ceremony of sorts, the funeral, and it was scary. I was scared. After that, nobody spoke about it. And then as the years go on, so many people in my life have died, from my father, my uncles, my aunts. I've had friends who've died. And it just, at some point, it was only a couple of years ago, there was a point where I was leaving my job. I decided to quit my job. And a friend of mine committed suicide. And it was really sad. There was nothing left, no note, nothing. And what happened was I decided to have a celebration of life for her. I'm good at putting together events and bringing people together. And that's what I did. And it was so much fun and cathartic, I guess. And also in the meantime, 2 other people died, one was a cousin of mine, died all within about 6 weeks. And then my neighbor died. And every one of those deaths were quite different from one another. But they all died alone and they all died quite tragically.
Wow.
And of course, what showed up shortly after was a course in ceremonies. And I looked at that and I went, wow, that's interesting. And part of it, the focus was on death and dying. So that's how that started my education around it. I literally dove deep and I did that. I did a weekend workshop with a bunch of death educators and other women actually who work in the death care industry in Vancouver mostly. And death doulas, it was just funeral directors. It was really amazing. And then I went on to take a program by Willow, which is an educational program to learn how to deliver workshops about death and dying. Wow. And that's the heart-centered, pragmatic side of it as well. And so now I do advanced care planning one-on-one with clients and also in groups, and I do group workshops. So yeah, it's been really oddly fun learning and doing.
Yeah, that's so interesting too, about the idea that talking about death itself or planning could be fun. That and I think that kind of speaks to the death literacy aspect. When, I'm sure you've read this, but maybe our listeners haven't. And I've probably talked about this book on the podcast before, but Stephen Jenkinson's Die Wise is such a beautiful book, and talking about living in a death phobic culture and about learning the skill of dying. And so I want to just read something you sent to me by email, and then maybe you can elaborate a little bit on it. You wrote that when we learn more about death, dying, and grief and share our experiences, we become more death literate, therefore reducing the anxieties and fears about end of life. This understanding can help us approach life and death with wisdom, honor, and respect. Beautifully said. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that? Because that's a lot. That's a lot for some people to even wrap their head around. How
Yeah.
could I, you know, how could I reduce my anxieties about the end of my life? Right. So might you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying, oddly enough, I mean, you know this as well. You're a curious person. I'm very curious. And so I have many interests, and I find anything that I'm interested in, maybe there's a fear around that or an anxiety. But as soon as I look into it, find out more, do research, I really enjoy research,
Mm-hmm.
and talk to people about it, then suddenly, of course, the fear sort of lifts, or at least it lessens.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you gain clarity as well about what matters most at the end of your life, what happens is it tends to illuminate who and what matters most in your life now.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so finding that out about your values and your hopes and your dreams at your end of life, or even before your end of life, it sort of empowers you to be more present and compassionate also with people who are dying,
Mm-hmm.
and more understanding. And it's truly amazing how, like in the workshops I do, the Willow workshops especially, what happens is people end up, by the end of the workshop, they're 2-hour workshops, they sort of end up, you can tell they're lighter, they're chatty, because it's also in community, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it may be strangers, but that can be easier for people to discuss their hopes and their fears and their dreams as well, is
Right.
being in a community of strangers, but people who are there for the same purpose.
Right, right. A common purpose. Why do you think it is that it's easier for us to maybe share these deep things with strangers, relative strangers?
I think it's because I know for myself, yeah, I find it almost easier to speak with people who I'm not really close to. I don't know why. I feel more, there's some sort of vulnerability about with the people that I care for and who care for me most, that if I tell them my fears, I don't know, it's kind of scary to me.
Mm. Yeah, like they're holding on to that. Like
Yeah.
they know that now, and that
Yeah.
can't be unsaid, right?
Yeah.
Whereas a
Yeah. And I
stranger is
want to
just going to
keep
get in their car and go home.
Yeah, it's like, no, don't leave.
Right.
My
Yeah.
own anxiety. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and death is such a taboo subject, which blows my mind because it is the one thing that we're sure of as soon as we're born. It's the one thing we know is going to happen. And yet nobody, like you said, with your grandmother's funeral, nobody talks about it. It's this awful, awful thing. So I've fantasized over the years about what it would be like to start teaching about death, very much likely in the way that you do with children in school. If there were classes about mortality and about living and also about dying. But so let's get back to this paragraph that I just read. What does it mean to be death literate?
So that's the education part of what I do. Um, so it's when you learn more about death and the reality of dying, and it can be the practical side of things. Most of us have probably not spent time with a person who's actively dying. And even not seeing a person after death, you
Mhm.
know. Some of us do when we see open caskets at funerals,
Yeah.
if we do. Um, but a lot of people don't.
Hmm.
And a lot of people also don't get to be at home, say, with their person who's died.
Yeah.
And these things are really important. They're really important as far as teaching us the reality of things and the reality of death. So prior to death, we can become more literate about how it actually happens.
Mm.
People have no idea and they don't want to ask as well. And so I personally have not had that experience yet, but I really look forward to that of um, being at home with somebody who's dying. I've been at hospitals when
Mm.
people are dying, and I really didn't enjoy that experience. I don't think that's necessarily, a nice way to be
Mm.
as you're dying, and I certainly don't want that for myself. So part of it, death literacy as well, is learning what choice you have around your own death and dying.
Yes.
So people don't know that they could maybe have a home funeral if they wanted. And their body can be kept at home, depending where you live, but,
Right.
3 days. You
Mhm.
don't have to pick up the phone and call the police or something if your person dies at home from a natural death. Um, there's no rush.
Right.
So there's ways of doing things that people just don't know about.
Right.
Like you said, we don't learn this in school.
Right.
And some cultures have, really interesting ceremonies around death and dying and leading up to death. But in my culture, no, like I said, the Catholic side, the Anglican side of my family, it's
Right.
just a very different way that I'm not interested in for myself.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I have, I think, similar ancestry. So we're both Italian and have the English side as well. Um, yeah, so that's very interesting. I did have that experience. My father died at home. Um, and my two sisters and I were essentially alone with him. I mean, he was a professor of poetry. He had a student there, and my sister, had her husband and her newborn, and, my boyfriend at the time was there. But essentially at the end, it was really just my sisters and me alone with my father at the moment that he passed. And it was such a leading up to it was so painful and
Mm.
so frustrating because he was in and out of lucidity and not even sure that he was dying, and so he had to be retold, and it was awful. But there was also that moment when he did pass that was very beautiful. It's this ineffable thing, of opening all the windows, letting the animals in finally because they weren't allowed to be in because he had cancer, letting them say goodbye and all of that. And but it was a really life-changing experience. So my question to you is you said you've been present in hospitals with people dying, and it wasn't what didn't that what wasn't jiving for you about that? I mean, I have my ideas, but I'd love to hear yours.
Um, so impersonal.
Mm.
Also, the hospital itself, the staff, um, there wasn't any sort of, it just seemed like any hospital room with anybody who is there because they're ill or for whatever reason they're in the hospital. There was no sort of, I guess, there's no sort of different sort of honoring around it because these
Mm.
people were expected to die.
Yeah.
But there was nothing done that showed that this was an important transition for somebody and for the family and friends.
Hmm.
And that, of course, doesn't need to be done by the hospital and the staff, but I think it would be really interesting if there was something within the medical system that did honor um, that stage of life, if you want
Hmm.
to say,
Yeah.
and that transition. So Yeah, it just seemed a little too medical to me.
Right, right.
Just said it.
Not a
Yeah.
lot of room for that kind of ceremony aspect.
No, and I mean, we could have done that, like I said, friends and family could have brought that to the hospital, to the room, to the bedside. But we didn't because at that time we didn't know that there were options, for example.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So for you, um, and maybe this is part of what you coach people with, is creating not just the awareness and the literacy around death and dying, but also the celebration of life part of it. Is that? Hi, it's Rachel here. If you'd like to dive deeper into your own self-development, but you're looking for an alternative to traditional talk therapy, I think you'll love the Foundation of Self Immersion program. For a full year, you'll get dynamic coursework you can complete on your own time, plus weekly coaching calls and monthly one-on-one sessions with me for personal support. Visit foundationofself.com and click on the events page for more information. That's foundationofself.com. Now, back to the episode.
I offer life transition ceremonies, and I'm not a celebrant per se. I've worked with a company that actually does virtual celebrations of life and in-person celebrations of life. And when I say celebrations of life, I know some people don't know the difference. The way I see it, funeral has a body present. It may just be a casket or an urn, but there's that presence. Whereas a celebration of life it can be before death, it could be after death, and generally it's also not. It doesn't have to be in a church. It doesn't have to have a religious aspect to it. It can be anything and anywhere. So part of what I do is not just around death, but it's around life transitions. So that could be menopause, it could be birth, death. And it's helping people to create a celebration of life for themselves, for family members. Sorry, I don't know if that actually.
It does. And I'm going to ask what seems like an obvious question, but
Yeah.
why is that important for us as human beings?
Well, marking any transition in your life is important because it helps you step into that new phase of life, which a lot of people don't really consider, except for moments like marriages. We have a celebration for a marriage. It's the same thing. Friends and family gather around and they help that couple step into this, they watch the ceremony, they have a ceremony around it, and they help that couple start their life anew. And it's in part for the couple, they've invited the people to recognize this as well, that now this is a different life phase. So that is the importance. But on other stages of life, like menopause, maybe it's something around losing a job, starting a new job, a birth, which a lot of the time there can be a celebration around a birth, but usually it's just for the woman and her friends, right?
Yeah,
we have
right.
But there's that. We celebrate birthdays. Some people don't, but that's another important moment to mark, is to honor yourself and the people in your life who have helped you get to another year of life. So it's the same with a celebration of life. And like I said, you can have it before. A lot of people now are opting for having a party or a celebration of life before they die. And a friend of mine did that. He had pancreatic cancer. And wow, to see this party come together and be there. I remember just standing there with all these people around. There was live music. There was tons of food that people had brought. He was just beaming. He's hilarious. He's hilarious. He's like that anyway, but I think it's because in part he was a Leo, but He was
That makes sense.
hilarious. And people got up and said things about him, and he just had such a good time. And that was about 3 months before he died. It was great.
Mhm.
It was really
Yeah,
great. So
beautiful.
I'd like to see more of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying, I mean, I can hear like clicking in the listeners' minds, like, maybe that's not a bad idea
Yeah.
because we culturally, there's that idea of what would it be like to attend my own funeral. But how amazing to think that you could actually be present at your own celebration of life as that is transitioning out. Yeah. But right, so this idea of ceremony and celebration being the transformation part of it, right?
Mhm.
And what is, I guess I'm getting at what's on the other side of that transformation. How do we integrate that? So if
Mhm.
we maybe you can use the example of your friend. What was it like for him to have had this celebration of life before he died, 3 months before he died?
Oh.
How was the 3 months for him?
I was with him again probably a month before he died. And, of course, physically he had changed quite a bit. But what had happened was um, he just seemed a bit lighter and brighter, regardless of the pain and what he was going through. And he's trying to give me things in his, which paintings do you want? All that. And had friends and family around all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, basically all the time up until he died.
Yeah.
And he already was a social person, but I think it just, we were looking through old photos of his, which was really great that I hadn't seen. You know, yeah, really amazing. I don't know. I just felt he was in a really good headspace.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think that really helped him move into that phase, that next phase, whatever
Yeah.
that is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's sounds beautiful. And I think maybe it speaks a bit to um, moving past some of this death phobia that we have in our culture, that it's something to not speak about or something to avoid or, but rather to say, this is what's happening. We know that this is at the end of this energetic iteration, which is our life, because of course, energy doesn't die, it just changes form, right? So, um, what would you say? This is probably impossible to answer. What's the best piece of advice you can give about preparing oneself to even begin thinking about death, not necessarily as a positive, but as a reality that we shouldn't avoid? How can we think differently about it?
Well, get curious. It's the education side of it. Whether it's going to YouTube and looking up videos on death and dying, and there's some really, it depends on your sense of humor. So, I grew up with Monty Python,
Yes, yes.
uh, and Carol Burnett and
Mm-hmm.
Bugs Bunny. Those are my three sources. I've thought of that of my type of humor.
Yeah.
And Monty Python, I don't know if you remember the sketch, and I've been planning on posting it because I just love it. It's the one, I mean, they do a lot around death because that's just the way it is. But the
That's
one
pretty
with the
humorous.
knights and
Yes.
chopped his arm off. He's like, come on, come
Yes, it's
on.
just a
I mean, the
flesh
guy's
wound.
all,
Yes.
yeah, it's a flesh wound. He keeps going on and on. And I
Right.
mean, I
From the
don't
Holy
think you see
Grail.
the guy die at the end, but in a way, it's kind of making fun of like this guy's just persisting,
Mm-hmm.
on and there's humor around it,
Sure.
which is different than the movies we see about, with people getting killed and etc. But I like having humor around things. There's some great, I mean, I think I'm surrounded by people who offer death education. So to me, I think it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, but if you do go to YouTube and you just want to Google, dying or death, whether you want to listen to Stephen Jenkinson or you want to find somebody, I just forgot her name, and she's great. She's hilarious. She's a mortician, and her posts, her videos are all, like kind of what some people might think are morbid, but they have a sense of humor and they're direct. And yeah, it just changes the way you feel about it if you
Right.
start to educate yourself around death and dying.
Yeah, humor is such an important element too, because it's something we need in life. I
Hmm.
mean, there's a reason why one of the nine muses was Talia, the muse of comedy, and and that's part of it's holy. Comedy is holy. So when we think about applying that to death, that might be a really nice transition into being able to look at death in a different way, because what we're really talking about is the death of this iteration. We're
Hmm.
not really talking about cosmic death because that doesn't exist, all of collective or as the Taoists call it, primal unified awareness. We're all part of that anyway. But what we're talking about is the individual self that we're not prepared to kind of release yet.
Hmm.
So part of that celebration and to be able to see all that with humor, the celebration of life, and to be able to understand, yeah, this is where we're all heading. Let's educate ourselves. Let's make sure that we know, what this is about. And I think make it our own in a way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah. I
think
wonder if
that's.
you could talk about that for a second about uh self-agency and death. Yeah,
Mhm.
about being able to have a say in the way that we want to die. um
Yeah.
do you coach people around that?
Yes. So that's part of the end of life planning. So the pragmatic side is advanced care planning or doing an advance directive. Most people don't know what that is. Most people know what a will is, but they're not even sure unless they've done one, which a lot of people haven't. They're not even sure what that entails, and a lot of people think that a will, a legal will, is all that they need. So the other side of that is what you're saying, is what you're asking me is, what are your own wishes for your death? And some people are like, well, I'll be buried, or I don't care. And
Right.
so that's another part of it. And it's like, well, first of all, there are other options than burial or cremation. One of the workshops I do is greening your death and aligning your
Hmm.
values. So, most people don't know, but now there's composting. So
Yeah.
your body can be composted and amazing. There's also alkaline hydrolysis, which is a much more gentler way on the environment. In fact, it's completely gentle as opposed to cremation. But what it does is it's the same thing as cremation, but there's no fire. It's water cremation. And what happens is your body, what's left are your bones, and then the bones are cremulated, which is actually what cremation is. Your bones are cremated, but they're ground up into a powder. It's not ashes.
Hmm.
And then that can be given to the family to have
Wow.
some remains, also like in a fire cremation
Hmm.
ceremony.
Or to have
Oh,
for burial.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Or release,
Hmm.
or to keep, or to make into something, which is possible.
Sure.
Um, so those are just a couple of options. Also, green burial is becoming incredibly popular. I'm I There's a cemetery near me. It's a massive cemetery, and I was talking to her the other day, the manager, and she's like, "Yeah, we need to keep making space for more green burials because it's just become such a huge thing. A lot more people
Hmm.
want it." And a green burial means that you're actually placed maybe just in a shroud. Your body is not embalmed, and some people don't know that you don't need to embalm a body.
Hmm.
Yeah, you don't need to embalm a body. It depends if it needs to be viewed for the family and friends, but you don't necessarily need to do that or hold on. It was actually President Lincoln's. He was the first famous body to be embalmed, and the
Oh.
reason was his body went around the United States to be viewed.
Hmm.
But anyway, it's to preserve a body, and we don't need to preserve bodies when we're putting them in the ground.
Right.
So with a green burial, you might be in a shroud or a willow basket, and you would be buried. I think it's around 3 foot burial instead of 6 feet under.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, the reason for that is that allows for the body to decompose quicker than if it was 6 feet down,
Mm-hmm.
where it's
Mm-hmm.
cooler and there's not as many microbes.
Right.
So that's another way. Yeah, so people when they find that out, they kind of go, oh, and people don't know that they don't need to be their body doesn't need to be embalmed. People don't know they can have a body at home and have a home funeral. People
Mm-hmm.
don't know that there are death doulas out there that help people with death,
Right. Right.
and can vigil or just help people ahead of time.
Yeah. That you don't have to go through it alone, which
Yeah,
is also part of Western culture, is that everything stays insulated instead of relying on the community.
yeah.
And there are people who are trained to assist in this area. Yeah.
Mhm.
A question that comes up, and I love the idea of green burials. There's actually a place in the town where I live, and I was so happy to see that they were there, the little shop front for just what you're talking about, willow baskets and green burials. One of the questions that I have heard, and I thought, and maybe some of the listeners have this question too, if, for example, you die from a disease,
Mm.
is it bad to put that in the earth at some point? Is that toxifying in some way? You know?
That's interesting. I haven't actually been asked that question directly, but it's also never come up in all of the and with all the people I've spoken to. Do you mean like somebody who's maybe had chemicals in their body, like due to having cancer or?
Yeah,
Yeah.
or anything that might, what's still in the body that might be affecting the soil or whatever around it. It was a question that came up when my father died too, because he died of liver cancer and
Mhm.
his body was just riddled. But he wanted to be buried on his property. He wasn't, for other reasons I won't get into right now. But yeah, it became a question that we had, and there was no one really there to answer it. And I've heard it since, but or read it, I can't remember. But it's an interesting thing to consider.
It
Yeah.
is. And I don't know the answer to that
Okay.
question, but what I would say is, for example, think of, Chernobyl. After the Chernobyl disaster, years later, what first came up were mushrooms.
Oh,
And
gotta love them.
the mushrooms are used in remediation. Phil
Mm-hmm.
Stamets, who lives
Famous.
in
Yeah.
Oregon,
Mm-hmm. Oh,
a lot of his research has been about bioremediation using
yes.
mushrooms,
Mm-hmm.
right? And apparently you can eat the mushroom after it's taken the toxins out of the earth,
Right.
because it actually has a way of getting rid of the toxins within its fruiting body.
Right.
So I don't know, but
Yeah, it sounds like nature will take care of itself, is
I think
basically what
it
they.
does.
Yeah, and
It
I
does.
love Paul Stamets. He's amazing, and
Yeah.
he did this whole thing about cleaning up oil spills with mushrooms,
Yes.
and yeah, so maybe we answered this question, Maria. I don't know. It sounds like
I'm
we
going to look
did.
into it.
Well, anyway, I could go on, but how can people reach you?
Best way to reach me is through my website, which is liveanddiewise.com,
Mm-hmm.
or my email, hello@liveanddiewise.com.
Okay, beautiful. I'm going to put that in our show notes. And I also have, you're on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn. So I'm going to have all those links in there too, so people can find you. But thank you so much for this very important conversation.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. It's nice to meet you.
You too. Hi, this is Rachel Astarte from the Self Talk podcast. I'd love for you to send me your emails with questions or stories about yourself. What are you looking for? What are your questions? What are you grappling with in your own personal life? that has to do with your identity, with yourself, with your very existence. These are the things that we're going to talk about during the podcast. And go ahead, it's all right, get deep. I can handle it. So send them to Rachel@selftalkpodcast.com, and I'll see you on the next episode.